My name is Ethan Cole, and if you had told me that my best friend's sister's wedding would be the night that destroyed everything I thought I knew about myself, I would have laughed in your face, because nothing about that evening looked like the beginning of a catastrophe when it started. It was a Saturday in late September, the kind of golden autumn evening where the air smells like dying leaves and possibility, and I was standing in the parking lot of the Riverside Event Hall in my cheapest suit, adjusting my tie in the rearview mirror, and trying to convince myself that the reason my hands were shaking was the cold, and not the fact that I was about to spend an entire evening in close proximity to Liam Carter, my best friend of 7 years, the person I had been quietly, desperately, painfully in love with since the middle of sophomore year of high school. Liam and I had met in Mrs. Patterson's AP English class, when he lent me a pencil I never returned, and somehow that borrowed pencil had turned into 7 years of inseparable friendship, of late-night drives and shared playlists and sleeping on each other's couches during bad weeks, of him being the first person I called when my grandfather died and me being the one who held him through his parents' divorce, and through all of it, through every single moment of closeness that should have been enough. I had been carrying this secret like a stone in my chest, this knowing that the way I felt about him was not the way straight men felt about their best friends, that the warmth I felt when he laughed was not normal friendship warmth, that the way my pulse quickened when he put his arm around my shoulders was not something I could explain away with brotherhood or bonding or any of the comfortable words I used to wallpaper over the truth. I was 23 years old, I was closeted, I had never said the words "I'm gay" out loud to another human being, and I had gotten so good at performing the role of straight best friend that I sometimes forgot I was acting. Liam's sister Sophie was getting married to her college boyfriend, and the wedding was being held at this old converted barn venue, with string lights everywhere and mason jars full of wildflowers, and all the rustic Pinterest aesthetics that made me feel like I was living inside someone's engagement photo shoot. And I had been dreading it for weeks because Liam was the best man, which meant he'd be busy all night, which meant I'd be sitting at a table full of people I didn't know, pretending to be happy. Pretending I wasn't counting the minutes until I could go home and fall asleep watching the same movie I'd watched 100 times. But what actually happened was that Liam found me almost immediately after the ceremony, grabbed my arm, and said he needed me to come with him because he was about to lose his mind giving the best man speech, and he needed someone to tell him it would be fine. So we ended up sitting on the tailgate of his truck in the venue's back parking lot, him in his fitted gray suit with his tie already loosened, and his dark hair falling across his forehead the way it always did. And the sun was setting behind the trees, painting everything amber and gold, and he was rehearsing his speech out loud and I was listening and giving him notes, and it felt so normal, so perfectly, painfully normal. And then he stopped mid-sentence and looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before, something raw and terrified and determined all at once. And he said, "Ethan, I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen before you say anything." And my heart stopped because I recognized that voice. That was the voice people used when they were about to change everything. And I sat there on the tailgate with my legs dangling and my cheap suit wrinkling and I waited. Liam took a breath and he said, "I've been trying to figure out how to say this for over a year, and I can't do it in a text, and I can't do it over the phone, and I can't keep pretending that what I'm about to say doesn't exist, so I'm just going to say it." And then he told me that he was in love with me, that he had been questioning his sexuality since junior year of college, that he'd been seeing a therapist about it, that he'd spent months trying to understand what he felt and who he was, and that every road, every path, every line of questioning led back to me. That he loved me not as a friend, not as a brother, but as something more, something he didn't have the right words for yet, something that scared him more than anything in his life had ever scared him. And I sat there on the tailgate of his truck in the parking lot of his sister's wedding, and I didn't move, I didn't breathe. I just stared at him while my entire internal world rearranged itself around this single, impossible, reality-shattering piece of information. And then I started crying, not the gentle kind, not the cinematic single-tear kind, but the ugly, heaving, body-shaking kind that comes from years of suppressed emotions suddenly being released all at once. Because the thing I had wanted more than anything in my life, the thing I had convinced myself was impossible, was sitting in front of me in a gray suit with a loosened tie, and I didn't know what to do with it. Liam saw me crying and his face fell and he started backpedaling immediately, saying he was sorry that he'd misread everything, that he shouldn't have said anything, that he'd ruined everything, and I grabbed his hand and I said, "Liam, you didn't misread anything, I'm gay. I've been in love with you since we were 16. And the look on his face when I said those words, the way his eyes went wide and then crumpled with relief and joy and disbelief, that look is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life." We sat there for what felt like hours, talking in low voices while the wedding reception continued inside without us. And he asked me why I'd never told him, and I explained about my family, about my father specifically, about the man who had spent my entire life making casual, cutting comments about gay people at dinner tables and Thanksgiving gatherings and football watch parties, the man who had once said, within earshot of 15-year-old me, that he'd rather have a dead son than a gay one. and how those words had carved themselves into my psyche so deep that I had built my entire identity around hiding, around performing, around being the son my father wanted because the alternative felt like a death sentence. Liam listened to all of it without interrupting, and when I finished, he pulled me into a hug so tight I could feel his heartbeat against my chest, and he whispered, "You're not going through this alone anymore, I promise." We kissed for the first time that night, sitting on the tailgate of his truck while his sister's wedding reception played out 100 yards away, and it was nothing like I'd imagined. It was better and more terrifying and more real than anything I had built in my head, and for about 2 hours I felt something I had never felt before, which was the feeling of being completely, unreservedly myself. And then my father walked into the parking lot. He had come outside to smoke, which he only did when he was stressed, which he always was at weddings because he hated crowds and small talk and anything that required him to pretend he was enjoying himself, and he saw us. He saw his son sitting on the tailgate of another man's truck, leaning against him with the unmistakable body language of two people who were not just friends, and the look that came over his face was something I will never forget because it wasn't surprise, it wasn't confusion, it was rage, immediate and total and white-hot, the kind of rage that makes a person's face go flat and empty right before it explodes. He didn't say anything in the parking lot. He just turned around and walked back inside, and I felt the blood drain from my face because I knew with absolute certainty that my life as I knew it was over. The drive home was silent. My father didn't speak. My mother, who had ridden with him, kept glancing between us with this confused, worried expression, clearly sensing the nuclear tension but not understanding its source. When we got home, my father went straight to his study and closed the door, and my mother asked me what was wrong, and before I could answer, my father's voice came through the door, loud enough for the whole house to hear, and he said, "Ask your son what he was doing in that parking lot." And that was how I came out to my mother, not on my own terms, not in a planned conversation, not with preparation or gentleness, but as collateral damage in my father's fury, and the conversation that followed was the worst night of my life. My mother was hurt and confused, and kept asking questions that I couldn't answer without making things worse. And my father said things that I don't want to repeat because they live in my body like splinters. Things about disappointment and shame and choices, as if being gay were a decision I'd made to spite him, as if the years I'd spent hiding and suffering and hating myself were just a performance he'd been kind enough to tolerate. He told me I was no longer welcome in his house. My mother tried to intervene, tried to mediate, tried to reason with him, but he was beyond reasoning. And so I packed a duffel bag at midnight and I left, and I drove to Liam's apartment, and I sat on his couch and I couldn't stop shaking, and he held me and I told him everything, and he looked at me with this fierce, steady, unwavering love, and he said, "Then we build a new life, starting right now." The weeks that followed were brutal. My father didn't call. My mother texted me sporadically, short messages that danced around the real issue, things like, "Are you eating?" and "Your father is calm now," which I knew wasn't true because she wouldn't have needed to say it if it were. I moved in with Liam, sleeping on his couch because we hadn't figured out what this new reality looked like yet, navigating the strange, wonderful, terrifying process of being in a relationship with the person I'd loved in secret for 7 years while simultaneously grieving the loss of my family. Liam was patient with me in ways I didn't deserve. He didn't push me to be more out than I was ready for. He didn't make me feel guilty for the moments when I flinched at his touch in public, or when I asked him not to post photos of us together, or when I introduced him as my roommate to the delivery guy. He understood that I was a person in the middle of a demolition, that the walls I'd built were coming down but the rubble was still everywhere, and he helped me clear it piece by piece without ever making me feel like I was too much work or too damaged or too slow. I started therapy, which I'd never done before because my father didn't believe in it, and my therapist, a quiet, sharp woman named Dr. Reeves, helped me understand something that changed everything, which was that my father's rejection was not about me. It was about him. About his fear, his conditioning, his inability to reconcile the son he'd constructed in his head with the real human being standing in front of him. And that understanding didn't make the pain go away, but it gave the pain a different address. It moved it from the center of my chest to a place where I could look at it without being consumed by it. 3 months after the wedding, my mother called me and asked if I would meet her for coffee, alone, without Liam, without my father, and I agreed because even through all the hurt, I missed her. I missed the woman who had braided my hair and read me bedtime stories and held my hand at the dentist's office, and I needed to know if that woman still existed. We met at a coffee shop across town, and she was already there when I arrived, and she looked older than I remembered, more tired, like the last 3 months had aged her years. And when she saw me, she started crying before I even sat down. She told me she was sorry. Not the careful, qualified sorry that people offer when they know they should apologize but don't really mean it, but a raw, broken sorry that came from a place of genuine reckoning. She said she'd spent the last 3 months reading everything she could find about LGBTQ issues, that she'd joined a support group for parents of queer kids, that she'd begun to understand how her silence had been its own kind of betrayal, how standing by while my father said the things he said was not neutrality but complicity. She asked me about Liam, and I showed her a photo, and she touched the screen gently and said, "He has kind eyes," and I almost broke down right there in the coffee shop. She told me she was working on my father, that it was slow, that he was stubborn and frightened and entrenched in beliefs that had been passed down to him by his own father, but that she believed or wanted to believe that there was a path forward. And then she said something that I think about every single day of my life. She said, "Ethan, I should have fought for you sooner. I should have fought for you the moment I knew you were different," which was long before you had the words for it. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making up for that silence. I didn't forgive her that day. Forgiveness, real forgiveness, takes time and consistency and proof that the apology wasn't just a moment but a permanent change. But that coffee shop conversation was the first crack in the wall, the first evidence that my family was not entirely lost, that there was something left to rebuild, even if it would never look the way it did before. 6 months after the wedding, my father called me. It was a Tuesday evening, and I almost didn't pick up because the number on the screen made my stomach clench, but Liam squeezed my hand and nodded. And I answered, and my father's voice was different, quieter, smaller, stripped of the authority and bluster that had defined it my entire life, and he said, "I'd like to see you, if you're willing." We met at a park bench, not his study, not his territory, but neutral ground, and the conversation was halting and painful and full of long silences where neither of us knew what to say. And he told me he was scared, that he didn't understand this, that everything he'd been taught told him this was wrong, but that he'd watched my mother change over the last 6 months and he'd seen something in her that he couldn't ignore, a peace and a strength that came from choosing love over fear, and he wanted that. Even if he didn't know how to get there yet. He didn't apologize, not that day. But he asked me about Liam, and when I told him that Liam made me happy, that Liam made me feel like a whole person for the first time in my life, something shifted in his face, something microscopic but real, and I knew that it wasn't enough, not yet, but it was a beginning, and beginnings are the hardest part. Liam and I have been together for 2 years now. We have an apartment with a kitchen that's too small and a couch that's too big and a life that is messy and imperfect and beautiful in ways I never could have imagined on that September evening when everything fell apart. My relationship with my father is still complicated. We have good days and bad days, and there are still conversations we can't have without one of us shutting down, but he came to our apartment for dinner last month and he shook Liam's hand and he said, "Thank you for taking care of my son," and I saw Liam's eyes go bright, and I felt something release in my chest that had been held tight for years. My mother comes over every Sunday. She brings too much food and stays too long and asks too many questions about our lives, and I love it. I love every single suffocating minute of it because it means she's here, she's present, she's trying. If you're watching this and you're where I was, hiding in a house that feels like a cage, loving someone you're afraid to love, being someone you're afraid to be, I need you to hear me. The explosion is not the end of the story. The destruction, the pain, the night you pack a duffel bag and drive to someone's couch, the silence from people who are supposed to love you unconditionally, none of that is the ending. It's the middle. And the middle is where the hardest, most important work happens, the work of becoming real, of shedding the version of yourself that other people built and stepping into the person you actually are, even when that stepping feels like falling. Don't wait for the wedding night to start being honest. Don't wait for your father to find you on a tailgate to begin the conversation you've been terrified of having. The longer you carry the stone, the heavier it gets, and eventually it doesn't just weigh you down, it reshapes you, it bends your spine, it teaches you to walk through the world crooked and call it normal. You deserve to walk straight in every sense of that word. You deserve to be loved out loud. And the people who can't love you out loud, they don't get to define the shape of your life. They get to catch up or they get to watch from a distance, but they don't get to stop you. Don't wait for tragedy to wake you up. Choose presence today. Choose honesty today. Choose yourself today, even if your hands are shaking, even if the parking lot is empty, even if no one is standing behind you. Because I promise you, on the other side of that fear, there's a couch that's too big and a kitchen that's too small and a life that is impossibly, imperfectly yours. And it's worth every single step through the fire to get there.